You may notice that the Honorable Gary Lunn is not present with us this evening. We tried very hard. I phoned him a month ago, phoned his office, and invited him to be on a panel to discuss nuclear energy. Because as you know, he's one of the main proponents of nuclear energy as a solution to climate change and also as a means of being environmentally sound in the production of the oil sands. So I thought he would be very interested in coming this evening. After waiting for 3 weeks, I finally had a phone call, and I was very surprised to find out that he did not want to join us this evening. So I contacted Ottawa, and I wrote them an open-ended invitation, and I said for him to just name the day, and we would make sure that there was a panel waiting here for him, and I'm in the new year. So when Jim arrived today, we went over to his office, and unfortunately he doesn't work on Saturday, so he wasn't there. But Jim had a very strong message for him and donated one of his books through the little slot in the door. So when I heard that Gary Lunn was proposing nuclear energy as a solution to climate change, I started to Google to find out who had been doing some very important work in the nuclear issue. And I knew about Jim for years ago, doing a lot of work on uranium mining and the nuclear issue. And I really liked the title of his piece. It was Canada's Dirty Little Secret, and that was about nuclear energy. And then I found out that not only had he written about Canada's dirty little secret, he also was launching a new book that went even further and talked about Canada's deadly secret. So he also is the author of After Iraq, War, Imperialism and Democracy, and Social Policy and Social Justice, and Our Deadly Secret, Tracing Saskatchewan's Role in the Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons of Mass Destruction. Jim Harding is a former professor of justice and environmental studies and was director of research for Prairie Justice Research at the University of Regina. He lives in Regina, and so please welcome, he's here now, please welcome Dr. Jim Harding.
Thank you. And the Raging Granny has basically summarized my talk. So are there any questions? First, because I don't want to forget it, one of the people I acknowledge in the book is John Graham, who worked with us on the uranium issue in Saskatchewan in the late 70s and the early 80s, and was a very good and strong and thoughtful and heartfelt colleague in building the Native and non-Native alliance against uranium mining. And as you may know or ought to know, he's facing extradition to the U.S. to face trumped-up charges from the FBI. And so I encourage you to get the material at the table at the back and add him to your work. It matters, not because he has been active in non-nuclear work, but because it's a test of a number of legal issues. And we don't expect this government we're seeing what this government is doing with people who are facing capital punishment to undermine our Constitution and our commitments to international law. So we don't expect a lot from this government, but the voice has to rise around every one of these issues that matter. So I know he has a copy of the book because his daughter came to the meeting in Vancouver last night. We'll get more out of the evening if we talk and discuss and debate strategy. I will read a bit from the book just to set a context. But before I do that, the nuclear industry has had a bit of a free ride lately, in the sense of it hasn't been effectively challenged for some time. And they have been moving public opinion in their direction. The four nuclear myths that the industry is clean, safe, peaceful, and economic have gained some credibility, not justified, of course, because it hasn't been challenged effectively. And so somebody asked me last night, so why are you doing this? And I really didn't answer the question very well, so I want to say at least here what I think I'm doing, why I wrote the book and why I'm following it around the country. And I'm going to do Alberta, where the struggle is in the north now, and Ottawa Valley, where there's still a hunger strike, and possibly certainly Port Hope, where there's a contaminated town, and on it goes, really. But why am I doing this? Because I really think we got to be careful that we don't go from the frying pan of global warming into the nuclear fire. And right now it's touch and go. Even the UN panel is looking at climate change without looking at the militarization issue. There's things happening within the states and with our government that are clearly moving us towards a future where the nuclear industry, the nuclear military industrial complex, let's call it what it is, and the security state will actually be stronger in the process of addressing the climate change struggle. And we are fighting for ecological sustainability and human rights and human development. And we've got to keep that full scope. We can't be frightened into one tracking this and then erring in terms of sustainability, because a future, even if we do reduce the impacts of climate change, which by definition we can do the earlier we move towards conversion and renewables and sustainable processes, a sustainable society, not sustainable development. So by definition, the earlier we move in that direction, the more we can mitigate the climate change impacts. But do we really want to leave radioactive waste and more nuclear weapons proliferation in the wake of that? Like, how stupid are we? Can we count? Like, can we handle, 5 issues at the same time and come up with a complex but more effective strategy? So that's why I'm doing it, because I've been watching people increasingly succumb to one-dimensional tech fix thinking. The Premier of Saskatchewan, Lauren Calvert, succumbed to it. And that really motivated me to write this, when he started going around spouting that uranium was actually going to be the big solution to global warming. So I'm sorry, I apologize to the woman last night that I didn't answer the question. Maybe you can pass it on to her. I had already used up all my energy and I wasn't, thinking that clearly. But those 4 myths we need to discuss at length, a strategy for sustainability that's non-nuclear on the energy issue and includes the demilitarization and the needs for disarmament globally. Those 4 myths, keep them in the back of your minds for the discussion. Clean, safe, peaceful, and economic. Last night I read a little bit, because I spoke at the annual meeting of the Vancouver United Nations Association. I was very pleased to be invited, because I wanted the opportunity to speak to people who are close to the politics of the United Nations. And so while I won't highlight that tonight, if we want to discuss that, let's discuss it, because the United Nations crisis is part of why this climate change strategy has been able to be separated from the issue of nuclear proliferation. And I'll talk a little bit about the internal politics of the United Nations if it comes up, because the United Nations desperately needs reforming at this time. But to the book for a minute. Driving through the populated cities and rural areas of southern Saskatchewan, there is nothing to indicate that much of the world's uranium began its journey here in this province. The depleted uranium in, quote, conventional, unquote, weapons, the uranium in stockpiled nuclear bombs, the uranium used in nuclear energy, and the millions of tons of highly radioactive mine tailings littering the landscape, these all form part of a single intertwined global nuclear system, and Saskatchewan now holds the distinction of being the world's major front-end supplier of that system. In the southern part of the province, things look more or less the way they have for decades. Yes, most of the grain elevators are down and gone, and the big box stores continue to amass near the spreading suburbs, as they do elsewhere on the prairies. But there are no nuclear power plants as there are around the Great Lakes near the city of Toronto, nor are there any nuclear missile launching pads to remind us of the bigger nuclear reality as there are south of us in Montana. You have to travel to the far north, well past La Ronge, which is midway between the U.S. and the Northwest Territories border, to see the ecological scars created by the huge uranium mines at such places as Rabbit, Clough, Key and Cigar Lakes, or MacArthur River. The huge pits and the sheer magnitude of radioactive tailings are heart-stirring to anyone who has eyes to see. But even the deep scars and radioactive waste left on the land do not tell the whole story. To fully realize what the uranium industry is doing to the planet, you'd have to trace the yellow cake shipped from the uranium mines in the north to Cameco's refinery and conversion plant in Ontario, or to enrichment plants in the US or France. You'd have to trace its conversion into fuel used in CANDU and other nuclear power plants in many countries, and its consequent transformation through nuclear fission into long-living toxic nuclear waste like plutonium, a substance never before seen on planet Earth. And if you've got the stomach for it, you'd have to trace the fuel being converted to the fissional material that ended up in thousands of nuclear warheads. You'd have to witness the depleted uranium left from the enrichment processes going into the bullets now being questioned by the United Nations, but used nonetheless by the US or NATO in its 5 most recent wars, and used in the casing of H-bombs ready to play their part in any number of possible genocides, brewing in the war rooms of nuclear weapons powers. Only then, driving through this Canadian heartland, armed with such knowledge as is presented in this book, would you begin to comprehend the full ecological and moral implications of mining uranium in Saskatchewan. Well, I can't tell you I can't tell you the whole story. It's a 30-year story, and then tries to even go back to the 50s, to the period of secrecy before we had an anti-nuclear movement in the late 70s. But as part of the story, when the NDP that launched a publicly owned uranium mining industry was defeated, and the Tory government under Grant Devine took over, they privatized the public utilities, which has become Cameco. It was linked with Eldorado Nuclear, a federal Crown corporation, both coming out of the Manhattan Project and nuclear weapons. Cameco, though listed as a Canadian corporation, is majority owned now by US owners. It is the largest uranium mining company on the planet, created by a social democratic government to attempt to create royalties to mitigate the reduced transfer payments from the federal government to pay for health care. And that was the mentality. I've done, so like I'm breaking from the book here, but I do have a story. So I've done it's not in the book, but I've done an analysis of the royalties which were supposed to come from this publicly owned uranium mining industry. And if you take the curve of the value of the sales of uranium, which of course as Saskatchewan became the front end, now producing close to 35% of the world market, you have a curve like this in terms of the value of the sales. And it's massive, clearly. It's the people who have stocks in Cameco are making money just like they are if they have stocks in oil. The interesting logic to this whole system is get rich on destruction and unsustainability, because you'll make more money if you invest in things that create climate change and increase the chances of proliferation. There's obviously something wrong with the economy and the concept of value. That's the curve for the value of the shipments. The royalties of the province is flat to the present. It had a small, little upward rise when it was a public utility, but nothing paralleling the value of the sales, and it's been flat ever since. So it's very clear where the wealth is going. So that's the end of the Social Democratic project. It's not paying for health care or education, but the next thing will be it'll somehow save us from climate change. In that period when it was privatized into this present system, the NDP changed its policy to phase out uranium and to move to some sustainable things by 1983. In 91, the NDP got back in power in Saskatchewan, the Romano administration. They inherited a huge debt, and they also inherited memorandums of understanding with AECL to create a CANDU 3 nuclear reactor industry in Saskatchewan, to bring a boom to the drought-stricken Prairie province, to export reactors to the third world to compete with that 400 megawatt size coal plant. We fought that and we won that, and people need to understand the victories. There was an attempt to build a uranium refinery before that. We fought that and we won that in '80. But when the NDP got back in power, even though these victories had occurred, this is what happened. The new NDP policy made new uranium mines conditional on approval by the province's mandated environmental review process. So the NDP's been back in power 2 years and has convinced the delegates to reverse their policy. The panel submitted its first report in October 1993. Now, this is on a whole new rash of mines, bigger than the ones that were expanded in the 70s. In spite of clear pro-nuclear bias in its terms of reference, the panel forcibly rejected one mine and called for a 5-year postponement of another, sending shockwaves through the corporate and bureaucratic world. Finally, after years of presentations at public inquiries and being mostly ignored, non-nuclear activists felt vindicated. Issues of cumulative environmental and social impact and economic underdevelopment were being taken seriously by the federal provincial review. Our renewed confidence in the public review process was, however, short-lived. It soon became clear that not only was party policy of no real consequence to the governing NDP, but neither was its own environmental review process. By then, the Saskatchewan NDP had earned a nationwide reputation for flip-flopping on uranium mining. There's probably no issue over which it has squandered so much of its political, even moral capital, and it was about to risk losing the very little it had left. The rejection of the Midwest mine was comprehensive. The panel found that risks greatly outweighed benefits. Mining methods were unacceptable, and the high-grade uranium, arsenic, and nickel posed serious problems in underground spaces. The company had left more than 600 exploration holes uncapped, posing a threat to workers' health. They vent radon gas. Contaminated effluent also posed an environmental threat, and uncertainties remained about the disposal of uranium tailings. Finally, there were concerns regarding the cumulative effects of this mine and others concentrated in the ecoregion near Wollaston Lake, and the risks posed to the public by the transport of the high-grade ore on Saskatchewan highways. At the end of the contentious 1992 NDP convention, where the party barely reversed its position, Romano made the unambiguous promise, quote, "If the panel says red light, there is no further mining in Saskatchewan. I can't see any government of any stripe saying we're not going to pay attention to that. I think that's the end of it," unquote. However, once the panel reported to the government, Romano gave clear signals that the previous guarantee to respect party policy in the review process was not on. NDP Environmental Minister Bernie Wiens broke with the agreed review process, saying he would take further submissions until the end of November. This opened the door for the uranium industry and its business allies to fervently lobby the government to not follow the Joint Panel's recommendations. The Joint Panel stated that failure to accept its recommendations, contrary to the promise of the Premier, would damage the credibility of the review process. It was over. The Joint Panel was hamstrung from the start by terms of reference that ignored uranium end uses. Now, a lot of this book is about how the industry has advanced incrementally without ever looking at the full industry. This is the method in environmental reviews. You look at a refinery, you don't look at mines or reactors or weapons. You look at mines, you don't look at end uses. This group of panelists were convinced by their extensive investigations that they had to draw this matter to the attention of the provincial and federal government. And they wrote, quote, "There is no process whereby exported Canadian uranium can be separated from uranium derived from other sources. Therefore, no proven method exists for preventing incorporation of Canadian uranium into military applications. Current Canadian limitations on end uses of uranium provide no reassurance to the public that Canadian uranium is used solely for non-military applications by purchasers." This is the panel appointed under federal and provincial regulations in 1993. The Joint Panel also agreed there were still no baseline health or epidemiological studies by which the impact of uranium mining could be fully assessed. Such studies had been recommended 15 years beforehand in 1978 by the Clough Lake Inquiry, which was occurring when you fought for a moratorium on uranium mining in BC during that same period, and you won a 7-year moratorium. Almost 30 years later, in 2007, there is still no baseline data, which is the first step in any credible social or health impact research. So the industry continues to be allowed to operate in the dark without any fundamental ecological or legal accountability. Like nuclear waste buildup, worker and community health has been put so far back on the back burner that it has fallen off the stove. The choice couldn't have been clearer for the Romano government. Either the NDP government of the day respected its review panel and party policy and made health, environmental protection, and northern justice its priority, or it abandoned these for political economic expediency. Which was it to be? Would an NDP government finally stand up on the uranium issue? Not surprisingly, uranium mining again became a burning issue at the November 1993 party convention. Some of us leafleted the convention to be sure delegates were confronted with the glowing contradictions. A resolution was carried, reaffirming the 1999 party policy, which meant the NDP cabinet should uphold the decisions of its review process. On a cold, clear, wintry morning early in 1994, I waited with an activist colleague outside the press room of the legislative buildings for the NDP cabinet's decision. In the end, industry, not the review process, not NDP party policy or the North, prevailed. All mines got the go-ahead with minor conditions. It was to be business as usual. In the crunch, the Romano government turned its back on the party policy it had crafted, and for all practical purposes, party democracy as well as public participation in environmental protection was dead in the province. The lines between the NDP and other parties on environmental credibility were now irrevocably blurred. And they were aware of the weapons connection. This will be relevant in the future because there will be accounting. There will be accountability. Now, a little on the broad weapons connection, because of course it starts long before this 1993 first acknowledgement in an official body. There's a long litany of examples of Canada's direct role in this creation and proliferation of nuclear weapons of mass destruction. From the Manhattan Project in World War II, the uranium for Hiroshima came from Port Radium, Northwest Territories, to the first nuclear arms race of the 1950s and the 60s. The prototype CANDU developed at Chalk River produced plutonium for the nuclear weapons program of the United States, to the spreading of CANDU technology that facilitated proliferation, the two hotspots on the planet, India, Pakistan, and almost the Middle East. ACL tried to sell Saddam Hussein a CANDU reactor in the 80s. To the second nuclear arms race of the 1980s, while the NDP government was convincing everyone it could that it was simply another resource to bring royalties to the provincial coffers because there was going to be a boom in nuclear power as a response to the OPEC increase in oil in '73, there was no boom in nuclear power. But all of the production of uranium in Saskatchewan was sold to the United States. And it clearly contributed to the 37,000 nuclear weapons that were built under the Reagan administration, because there's no other accounting for the demand on it. And to the creation of a new line of radioactive depleted uranium weapons used in the Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq. Canada's been involved throughout in laying the ground for mass death and ecocide by nuclear means. And as Saskatchewan uranium mining has become the major front end in the global nuclear system, its role in nuclear weaponry has become more central. Well, let's just for a minute look at how this depleted uranium weapons connection occurs. We've already seen that the only safeguard against uranium being used for weapons is the Non-Proliferation Treaty signed in 1970. And this treaty is what the NDP outgoing Premier Calvert, the uranium company Cameco, and the federal government appeal to in their public claims that we are only producing uranium for peaceful uses. However, while this treaty, followed by the Test Ban Treaty, was an important step forward, it's not based on a solid understanding of how the nuclear fuel system and the weapons process works, and that was intentional when we talk about the politics of the world nuclear powers after the Second World War and how they constructed the United Nations, which we can talk about. To produce just 1 kilogram of 5% enriched uranium requires an input of over 11.8 kilograms of natural uranium and results in 10.8 kilograms of depleted uranium. In other words, over 90% of all Saskatchewan uranium that was ever sent to the U.S. for enrichment, supposedly for peaceful purposes as nuclear reactor fuel, has remained in the U.S. as depleted uranium. There's absolutely no distinction between the DU of Canadian origin or Saskatchewan origin and the DU of other origins, US, Australia, etc. It all goes into the same large stockpiles of depleted uranium. And clearly a portion of this large stockpile of depleted uranium has been used freely and without any compunction by the U.S. military for military purposes. Thus, there is some Canadian or Saskatchewan DU in every DU weapon. There's even more to the contemporary weapons connection. In spite of all the reassurances that our exports are only for peaceful purposes, in quotes, how can nuclear power plants be peaceful anyway? We'll talk about that after. In spite of all the reassurances, the DU from the common stockpile is also used directly in the construction of the metal warheads and H-bombs. This depleted uranium is responsible for at least 50% of the explosive power of each H-bomb and almost all of the radioactive fallout. Most people don't realize that the same DU stockpile was also used for half a century and more to produce the plutonium that is used in almost all of the nuclear warheads. All the reassurances posed are based on the Non-Proliferation Treaty collapse with this specific knowledge of how the weapons producing process actually works. Though our collective conscience may have been eased a little when Saskatchewan uranium contracts explicitly signed for nuclear weapons ended in the late 60s, our exports from then to now have continued to directly contribute to nuclear weaponry. Some of this weaponry has already been used. DU weapons were used in 91, the Gulf War in the Balkans, and Kosovo between 92 and 95, in Afghanistan in 2001, and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The tens of thousands of rounds used in the first Gulf War probably created somewhere in the range of 30 to 50 tons of radioactive and toxic waste on this fertile land. Childhood leukemia and some other cancer rates are already fivefold what they were in this area before the Gulf War, and the effects from the 2003 invasion and occupation have only begun to show. I heard medical evidence of this presented at the World Tribunal on Iraq in Turkey in June 2005. The scale of use of DU weapons and geographic range of the radioactive pollution are massive. 1,500 bombs were dropped on Baghdad during the first 24 hours of the shock and awe invasion of Iraq in 2003. An estimated 300,000 rounds of weapons containing depleted uranium were fired from A-10 tank buster planes during this assault. 7 to 9 days later, the measurements of uranium aerosols in the air at Aldermaston, England, increased fourfold, twice exceeding the threshold that is required to inform the United Kingdom Environmental Agency. These were the highest levels of uranium particles ever measured in Britain. Though there has been no mushroom cloud, the magnitude of the depleted uranium weaponry used since the first Gulf War dwarfs the radiation from the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. Lauren Morit, who I believe has spoken in Vancouver, she's an environmental scientist from California and has worked with the UN on the ban of uranium weapons. There's a commission apparently sitting. She states that a Japanese physicist has calculated the atomic radiation equivalence of the depleted uranium used to present to be at least 400,000 Nagasaki bombs. If you are like me, you'll hope this is wrong. The casualties of this magnitude of contamination would not die in a single firestorm, but from the insidious lingering effects of low-level radiation. Well, I'm not trying to frighten you, but that's the legacy, and the manufacturing of uranium weapons is accelerating. 36 countries have now the depleted uranium weapons. 6 produce them, and that includes Pakistan as a nuclear power. It now has its own arsenal of depleted uranium weapons. Israel had the depleted uranium weapons in 1973, but luckily did not use them in that war. And since writing the book, I've slowly started to piece another layer of the of the weapons connection with this industry back, and I've now found that they first envisaged the depleted uranium weapons in the Manhattan Project. And there was a military debate that ended in 1954 when the U.S. military decided to expand the nuclear weapons arsenal and to not go the radiological weapons route. And now they have. So we have both. And of course, the politics of this is important. When the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was global human shock to this. And the military in the United States, who wanted a monopoly of this weaponry, didn't get it because the Soviet Union moved very quickly, knew that they had to legitimize the technology, and we had the Atoms for Peace movement, which, by the way, didn't lead to any electricity for decades, but created the myth of the peaceful atom, too cheap to meter, and all of that story, which is total baloney when one looks at the cost of this technology. But they chose to go with nuclear weapons as used in Japan, but to attempt to give it credibility through the peaceful atom. Now, world opinion, I believe, and there are indications, is strong enough that if nuclear weapons of the mushroom type were in fact used, the energy of the human peace movement, which we saw before the Iraq invasion, would be so powerful that we would finally perhaps enter into the global collective consciousness required to move us towards disarmament. So they have chosen to instead move to the radiological nuclear weapon. And we have to, of course, change our mindset. We're not just going to be afraid of mushroom clouds. Invisible uranium contamination is, of course, what is now happening. But the magnitude of the depleted uranium weapons dwarfs, according to some, even the atmospheric testing that went on until the Test Ban Treaty. Now, I didn't know most of this because I had no way of knowing it. But as an example, let's walk through very quickly and then have a discussion. Let's walk through the nuclear myths of clean, and it's important, and then safe, and then peaceful. I think the peaceful one I've hopefully discredited. But they all have an appeal. The clean, well, of course, how can it be clean when this is what it does all along the nuclear fuel system? Massive tailings where about 80% of the radioactivity from the uranium ore remains. And the radioactivity in the tailings essentially starts with a product thorium with a half-life of 76,000 years, which then creates radium with a half-life of 1,600 years, which is continually emitting alpha radiation into the aquatic systems, the airways, etc. And of course, tailing ponds in the uranium industry, like all mining industries, break, flood. There's been 3 major accidents since these mines occurred: Key Lake spill, Wollaston Lake spill, and then the flooding of the Cigar Lake underground mine 2 years ago. I mean, these are the things that in the inquiries, the nuclear engineers convinced the political, scientific courts would never happen, and they've just continually happened, and the industry, of course, hasn't been shut down. They wouldn't have been approved if the probability that has been shown had been believed at that point. But the tailings management issue itself is huge, but of course you track it through enrichment and then spent fuel, and we know what's happening globally, is that we don't know what to do, and every nuclear power plant is the site of storing spent fuel. We are now confronted with a new scenario launched by the US in 2005, Bush's global nuclear energy strategy or project, which is aimed at getting uranium-producing countries to become the sites of nuclear waste disposal. And we've seen a crack in that plan yesterday with the defeat of the Howard government in Australia, or today, because it was Howard and Harper and Bush that were moving in this direction. We have to get rid of Harper, clearly. Bush is going to go soon, and the political action to defeat Harper is part of this non-nuclear strategy, because it is very clear that the Harper government and Lund not only support nuclear power in the tar sands as a facelift on reducing greenhouse gases without reducing greenhouse gases. You know what I'm saying here. The Roundtable on the Economy and the Environment, that is in fact an advisory body to the federal government, calculated their methods for reducing greenhouse gases by 20% by 2025, and the figures did not add up, and they had to go public saying, it doesn't make sense, Prime Minister, because it's not meant to make sense. This government supports nuclear power in the tar sands not to reduce greenhouse gases, I'll explain that myth in a minute, but because this attempt to sell it in the name of reducing greenhouse gases is a way to build the next generation of nuclear reactors, which will in fact take spent fuel from the United States and France and be the beginning of the nuclear waste system in northern Saskatchewan or Alberta, close to the mines. And the ACL has changed its tune. For 50 years, they bragged about natural uranium and heavy water coolants and the safety of the CANDU, and now they want to build the same kind of reactors as France and the United States so they can use reprocessed spent fuel as the fuel source. And don't believe it's safer because it's a more corrosive than in the fuel rods. The physicists I've talked to say it's an even more unstable nuclear waste. So, like, you're maybe just on the other side of the mountains from this battle, but it's the Alberta-Saskatchewan battle over moving to sustainable energy over the next 10, 15 years, and it's both about oil and nuclear. And the myth that nuclear is the alternative to oil is, of course, exposed by any number of facts which the press will not report on at present. One of the big ones is, if Saskatchewan is the biggest producer of uranium in the world, maybe we should see how it's enriched. You track it to the States, how is it enriched? In 2 huge, dirty coal plants in Kentucky, which release CFC, ozone-depleting gases that are not regulated under American legislation because of it being an industry tied to the military. And you know, it's interesting, you get it both ways. When they want to say it's a peaceful industry separate from the military, they say that. When they want to protect the whole thing from legislation, they say it's military. Well, the truth is it's both, always has been, always will be. So the scenario that's unfolding since the book, I laid the background because in '91, they began to propose the repatriating of nuclear waste back to Saskatchewan. And who proposed it? AECL and Cameco, because they want to build a full nuclear fuel economy, multinational economy. Cameco now owns Bruce Nuclear Power in Ontario. It owns the conversion plants that it took over from Eldorado, the Crown Corporation. It's close. It hasn't got enrichment, but if it moves to reprocessing, it will have almost completed its involvement, and it will be vying with the only other corporation on the planet that has a full technology from so-called cradle to grave, and I mean grave literally, and that's Areva, the huge French company. And who's active in Northern Ontario right now promoting nuclear power in the tar sands? Areva. And Areva may buy up AECL, which is a really weak company, and there's indications that Harper is moving towards shifting our nuclear technology into a US-French consortium. So this isn't in the book, but all the background to it. It's unfolding very quickly, but it could be stopped very quickly. Howard's gone. Harper's afraid to say he supports reprocessing. Lund retracted those comments the day after he said them in the Globe and Mail, but they've in fact been dealing with this scenario for 8 months prior to those meetings with Bush. So here I am. I've come across the mountains into Lotus Land where you have hydro and a premier who is with the California governor going to set the stage for radical reduction of greenhouse gases. But is he going to buy electricity on the grid provided by the nuclear consortium in northern Alberta if it goes ahead? Absolutely. So don't let the mountains fool you. You know, just on the other side of the mountains, this is unfolding. When Harper says Canada can become an energy superpower, what does he mean? Well, I did a book on after Iraq and the attempts to control security of supply for the military-industrial system, because the military is a massive consumer of fossil fuels, including in its nuclear, as we've seen. As the U.S. loses geopolitical controls in the other areas of oil, it is looking for a solider location, and we're it. And with, you know, I suppose I can say sadness in my heart, I know Saskatchewan is now in that struggle because we have the second most sources of heavy oil and almost all the high-grade uranium on the planet, second highest source after Alberta. And let me tell you how far we've gone down the road that's not sustainable, and then questions. When I went and looked in the government documents that were released as an action plan for the expansion of the Saskatchewan economy in its second century, because we had a centennial in 2005. And I started looking through the government documents. I kept coming up with these funny figures because somebody had actually taken the time in industry and commerce to calculate comparatively what the primary energy production in Saskatchewan was across sectors. And we're the second greatest producer of oil and gas after Alberta. And what did I find? I found that 80% of the primary production exported from Saskatchewan was uranium. 17% was oil and gas. That proportion will shift if heavy oil goes ahead. And I looked for renewables, and I looked for renewables, and I did. I found a category. This is 2004 statistics. 0.4% renewables. And they had to put hydro in to get that. So we have a couple of optic wind farms. And the contradiction I dealt with at the end of the book was, you know, you got yourself in this fix, speaking to the NDP. You got yourself in this fix. You told people it was a resource and we could just export it and then pay for our health care and education, and we'd be in the social democratic paradise. Finally, we'd be a half province and we have lush royalties coming in. You told them that. You lied to yourself about the weapons connection and the implications of the whole nuclear, radioactive, and weapons system. And here you are. You've built this non-renewable energy economy. We're only second to Alberta in terms of the number of jobs now that are tied to the non-renewable energy export economy. And then you realize that people in Saskatchewan want to move towards a sustainable future, so you say, okay, we'll start doing some renewables in our own grid. Tiny, tiny little grid compared to everywhere else, 2,500 megawatts. So, you know, token 100 megawatts wind, and we'll move towards 20%. We'll export oil that creates climate change. We'll export uranium and proliferation, but we'll build a sustainable, renewable grid for Saskatchewan people. And you know, the disconnect didn't work, and they didn't get elected because, in fact, everybody knew what they were doing, and the Sask Party said, let's get on with it. Let's have a boom with heavy oil and uranium. And so there we are. End of story. Of course, it's not sustainable. The question is, it carries massive risks, both climate change and nuclear proliferation. So we have to know where we are to counter it, to change it. The propaganda around it being a non-greenhouse gas emitter has to be challenged. It can be. It's a totally ridiculous scenario of replacing coal with nuclear. MIT study says if you were even to try that ridiculous project, you would need to build one reactor every week from 2010 to 2050, and you'd only increase nuclear electricity from 16 to 20%, and you wouldn't have ameliorated the increase of gases because you wouldn't have attacked the other sectors, i.e. you'd have robbed, it's a theft, you'd have robbed capital from energy efficiency, conservation, cogeneration, and the renewables that can actually cut the stuff at the front end by cutting demand or increasing efficiency of energy. The capital doesn't exist on the planet for that kind of nuclear scenario. Private investors do not back nuclear power. It's totally based on public wealth. And when you cost it, so now the myth of it being economic, when you actually cost nuclear power in terms of the subsidies, the price fixing, and the bailouts, Harper, the man who says he believes in a free market, just gave AECL, since he's been in power, $700 million, $500 million to clean up Chalk River and the White Shell plant, which is polluted in, the Chalk River is very polluted, and the White Shell AECL plant in Manitoba, and $200 million to AECL to try to make a design that's credible for this new reactor that will take spent fuel in the oil fields. That's $700 million that is not tied directly to reducing any greenhouse gases, is tied to maintaining and strengthening an industry that since 1952, accounting for interest and debt, has cost the Canadian taxpayer $75 billion in subsidies. So it's not an economic industry. The four myths, of course, connect. Why would governments put that kind of subsidies into an industry that right now, globally, only produces 2.5% of primary energy and about 15% of electricity, which is just a small chunk of the energy market? And the answer is weapons. The answer is weapons. It's not about energy. It's not about energy. And we see the scenario clearly now with the radiological weapons, and every nuclear power now is modernizing their nuclear arsenal. And the United States is making nuclear deals with India, who is not a party to the non-proliferation agreement, and pretending it can run the second lie on Iran. We had the first lie on Iraq, that we're going to have to take out Iran because it has enrichment facilities, which, by the way, it can legally have because it is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. You know, the world, Alice in Wonderland is alive and well in the nuclear industry. It's not clean in the sense of greenhouse gases. It is not safe. The only study that has looked at all the sub-studies of cancer rates around nuclear facilities looks at 17 studies, does a quality check on data, concludes, this is based on nuclear facilities, 136 of them in 7 countries, including Canada, that children 9 and under die of leukemia in the vicinity of nuclear power plants at a rate of about 28% higher than the regular population. And we know from 9 and under there's a developmental issue here in terms of the radiation and cell division. It's not clean, it's not safe, it's not peaceful, and it's definitely not economic. Thank you.